So what's the best mode to record for your videos on the Canon R5? And how does that compare with the Sony A1 from Gerald Undone's video? Let's talk about it right now. If you're new to my channel, consider subscribing and hit that like button whether you like this video or not. I'm just trying to reach more people, and if you find my content useful, I hope you don't have anything against that. But welcome to this video, and today we're going to talk about Gerald Undone's recent video that was like a week, maybe closer to 2 weeks ago at this point, regarding his decision to use the A1 and record in 8K. Now, if you haven't seen Gerald Undone's video, I definitely suggest that you go check it out by clicking that link up on the top corner that I just left it here. And in his video, he discusses his decision on switching from the A7S III to the A1. Now, one of the primary reasons that he's switching to the A1 is because he's recording a lot of his videos on the Atomos Ninja V, and that recorder allows you to record up to 4K at 60 frames per second, though his Sony A1 can record internally up to 8K. And what he found is that when he's outputting 8K into his Atomos Ninja, which only records up to 4K, he actually is able to get more detail in a 4K timeline than he would be able to get if he recorded just 4K internally on the A1. And that's due to the fact that the A1, when recording 4K, since it's a high resolution sensor, it kind of line skips the 4K. And he used this handy little graph that helped him to kind of sort that out and see actually what looks better. Now, to summarize quickly, the 4K internally from the Sony A1, because of its line skip, has the least amount of detail. But when he actually looked at the 8K footage, it looked great. And when he actually used the 8K footage in the Atomos, though it wasn't as high detailed as the 8K, it was still much better than the standard 4K. It's kind of like a 4K HQ that he's able to do by using the Atomos. And Gerald also saw that when he actually worked in a 4K timeline, if he recorded 8K and used that footage and then output it to 4K, because that's what he's doing for most of his content anyway, it looks pretty much the same as the content that when he output his camera using 8K and the Atomos just had it in 4K. So it was quite similar. But then it got me curious. He did the test for the A1 and he could see, okay, it works great on the A1, but the Canon R5 allows you to record several different modes of 8K, several different modes of 4K. Which one would give you the most detail if you're outputting into a 4K timeline? That's what I wanted to know, because unlike the Sony A1, the Canon actually has the ability to use the whole sensor and then downsample that into a 4K video and let you edit with it. Yes, I know it's been quite troublesome for a lot of the different file types in the Canon R5 to be able to edit that in post, which is why a lot of people went away from it. However, I found that when using the 4K like super compressed IPB that was released in the firmware version 1.3, you'll see that the detail that you get, because I looked at it and you could see it right here using the same chart that Gerald Undone did, the 4K Super IPB versus 4K All-I was basically no difference in detail. So 4K HQ still looks great, 4K standard still looks great. Now, to get the most detail, I wanted to see, okay, which one is the best? And there was a surprise that I actually got here, so stick around and I'll tell you what that surprise is with the results. First of all, look here, comparing 4K standard versus 4K HQ, no surprise there. The winner is 4K HQ with its amazing amount of detail when compared to 4K standard. So it's already doing that whole sensor readout and then downsampling it. So that, as you knew, would be the better choice. But now we want to compare it until the 8K modes. So I took, and all of these I used 8K super compressed IPB because, again, I found no visual difference in the detail when comparing All-I and IPB. So then I compared 4K HQ versus 8K, and there was a difference. The 4K HQ was not as detailed as the 8K. So I went a step further, and then I output like this comparison into a 4K file to see if it would be visible. Because Gerald Undone said 8K and 4K you couldn't visibly see a difference. Well, I tested it when outputting, and I found that the 8K, when output in 4K, still looked higher detail than the 4K HQ. So there's still a slight advantage when recording in 8K versus 4K HQ, but that's not to deter anyone from recording 4K HQ, because it still looks amazing. But there's another 8K mode besides the All-I and 8K IPB, which are, like I said, they're virtually identical. The comparison that I wanted to do, and I knew that there would be a difference, would be the 8K RAW versus the 8K IPB file to see which one gives me more detail. And that kind of surprised me. The 8K RAW has less detail than the 8K IPB. Now, we all know that the camera does some denoising and sharpening when creating the IPB file versus 8K RAW, which is strictly the RAW file. But the 8K RAW lost more detail than I expected, first of all. However, for some reason, I actually liked the look of 8K RAW. It just had a very pleasing amount of noise, very pleasing amount of like overall visual quality that I can work with. So then I compared 8K RAW versus like 4K HQ and 8K RAW versus standard, and 8K RAW is still higher detail than those modes. So 8K RAW is softer and not as sharp as 8K IPB. I also did a test where I over sharpened the 8K RAW and then compared that with the 8K IPB, and the 8K IPB is still that much sharper. There you go. If you want the sharpest results of video for whatever reason, you should record in 8K in either All-I or IPB, and you will get definitely the sharpest results of video. Coming in second place is 8K RAW, and then 4K HQ, and then 4K standard, which is like the softest of any 4K recordings. But the fact that the camera can record all of these modes is nice. And Gerald Undone also mentioned that it's a lot easier to edit the 4K files from the Atomos Ninja than it is to edit the files in 8K on his computer natively. So that's why he's choosing to do that. I've mentioned this a couple of times. For me, the fastest editing has actually been 8K RAW and using the proxy files that the camera creates in 4K IPB, because then you can just edit to your heart's content at a pretty good speed with that super compressed IPB, and I really haven't had any issues. But outputting does take longer when you record 8K RAW. So if you want to avoid all of that, just record that super compressed IPB and actually record it in 4K, because you'll find it's a lot easier to edit and post with 4K HQ than any of the other modes. So 4K HQ if you've got quick turnaround, 8K RAW if you have a little bit more time, and you'll still be able to edit quickly because of those compressed IPB files. Sure, Gerald Undone wants the highest quality for his studio and his setup, which makes a ton of sense. But do I need that type of quality now? Not for personal projects. However, if I'm thinking of professional projects, I definitely would. Right now I'm recording in 8K RAW because I want to, and again, I can edit quickly and I'm in no rush to get the video out. However, I'm sure there will be times where it's completely overblown and I could just do something quickly with 4K HQ and that super compressed IPB and still get a ton of detail. Because none of these are bad. None of them. But let me know what you guys think, and if you found the results interesting when compared to Gerald Undone's video and the A1. Which camera would you choose for detail? Let me know in the comments below, because I'd be curious to find out A1 versus R5 when it comes to highest possible detail. So that would mean 8K on both cameras. And I think that the A1 would win this one because it's slightly oversampled 8K. But who knows? We'll even be able to see it. Don't even know, because that also depends on the camera's processing. But it was nice and entertaining to actually do this and to actually take a crack at one of Gerald Undone's experiments for my own. So that answered my question, but thank you guys for joining me. And as always, you can make my day if you subscribe today. This is Magnus, and I'm out. And check out one of my videos here too if you're into camera stuff. See you guys later.